Good afternoon, I'm Arends van Zyl. I work for AfriForum in the campaign department for strategy and content. And today I'm here to talk to Mr. Barend Uys, who is the CEO of the think tank Opinor, and also Ernst Roots, who is the head of policy and action at AfriForum. And today we're going to talk about China in Africa, a report that was created by Opinor. And I'm going to ask them some questions just so we can get to the bottom of what is actually the content of the report, and so you can learn more in regards to what actually were the key findings in regards to it. So, Ernst, does this form part of the World Must Know campaign, or is this a campaign on its own?
Well, you could say it's both. It's certainly an issue that is important enough to be dealt with on its own, but as far as the way in which we've dealt with it so far, before publishing the report to the public, is we do also regard it as a component of the World Must Know campaign. So the World Must Know campaign is about informing the rest of the world about the extent to which minority rights are being violated in South Africa, or the extent to which minorities' freedoms are being denied. And there are various issues with regard to that, which isn't the focus of course, this particular report. But we also believe that the situation with China in Africa is very serious, and it's grossly underestimated, and that's why we regard it as something that the world must know.
All right, and then Barend, you are representing Opinor as the CEO. How did you go about creating and setting up this report and getting all the content for it?
Ernst, we followed a two-pronged approach. So firstly, we collected reports by institutions, and the availability of reports actually is already indicative of somebody worth of something worth researching. And then we also collected some media reports from respectable media outlets. And then the second part was to send a research team to the Limpopo province of South Africa, where the Makadu Special Economic Zone is a big project where China is involved. And the team there, they spoke to people on ground level in the Limpopo province. So from this case study, the field work we've done in the Limpopo province, and the reports that we collected, we compiled this report.
And then now, in terms of AfriForum's role here, do you intend to send this to someone who, and if you do, who might that be
so we've already sent this report to a whole bunch of people, but we haven't published it for public knowledge yet. So it's also a two-pronged approach, you could say. In the first sense, earlier this year we had a visit to the United States, particularly New York and Washington, where we spoke with several people, representatives of the US government at the State Department, people in the House and the Senate, the Foreign Affairs Committees of the House and the Senate. We spoke with a variety of think tanks, media institutions, commentators, and so forth. And we gave all of them copies of the report. And some of them have already responded, saying that they have read the report and they are very alarmed by the report. Especially some of the think tanks are also looking into this, the issue about the extent to which China is involved in Africa, because it's not only something that affects Africa, it affects the rest of the world, and particularly the US, that sees China as a force of competition, you could say. So it's important for people in the United States to be aware of what China is doing in Africa, because it will have an impact on the United States. So that's what we've done to date. And we do know the report has had a big impact in Washington with the people we spoke with. But then other than that, the point of this releasing the report for the public now is also to send it out internationally, to send it to countries across the world. I think it's important, especially for Western countries, to take note of this, because it has a significant consequence, not only for the US, but for the West in particular. And if you read the report, you would see that there's a very strong anti-Western sentiment developing within Africa, especially where China is involved.
And what you explained there is that this report was already created months before now. What prompted this? The creation of this report. What planted the seed that the world needs to know?
Well, actually, what prompted it was two different things. The one is our own concern, and a lot of questions we often get asked, and we hear these stories about China being involved in some issue in Africa, and often there's a lot of uncertainty. And an example of this was South African President Cyril Ramaphosa going to China regularly. And about a year ago, he came back from China, and he said that he had struck several deals with the Chinese government, but he didn't say what those deals were. We know that there are deals between South Africa and China, but we don't know what these deals are. And that already is a cause for concern. And we get questions a lot by people saying they saw the Chinese government being involved here, or Chinese companies being involved in certain projects, especially in Limpopo, the Limpopo province. So that's one reason. And the other reason is actually during previous visits to the United States, we picked up that there is also a lot of curiosity and questions about the extent to which China is involved in Africa and what is China doing in Africa. So we noted that within South Africa, there are questions about, uncertainty about what the extent of this, but also in places like Washington, D.C., people are asking questions about this. So the two together just said to us that, that's why we approached Opinor to say that we need to do a comprehensive study about this issue.
Right, and now, Barend, now that Arends has explained the reasoning behind such a report, why the world must know, could you maybe, if you had the opportunity to give a pitch about this to someone of influence in the world, or give them a summary of what is in this report, what would you tell them?
Arends, in the end, we basically summarized the report in 28 findings, but I think I will basically try to condense it in about 7 points. So the first thing, and I think Arends already touched on it, is that governments in Africa are increasingly turning towards China and then away from the West and, of course, also the USA. And this is not only in terms of trade, but also in terms of ideology. Secondly, China is investing vast amounts of capital in Africa, but the terms and conditions of these vast investments are basically unknown, or it's clouded in secrecy. It's really difficult to obtain information about, let's say, what is the commitment from the African government towards China. Thirdly, and this in the current day, I think this is very relevant, Chinese nationals and companies are involved with activities that are a threat to the environment. Now, there's many examples that we list in the report, but a few that one can name is rhino poaching in South Africa, ivory smuggling in Tanzania, illegal logging, illegal fishing, and the list, unfortunately, is quite long. Then there are also concerns about labor practices of Chinese companies in Africa. Sometimes it's got to do with health and safety issues in the workplace or living conditions. Out of own experience, I can testify to plants used as scaffolding in building projects and things like that. And then a worrying tendency of anti-democratic practices, where Chinese companies would have special privileges, and this is privileges that even companies from citizens of the same country, they would not enjoy the same privileges. And then, of course, there's also a tendency of undue influence on African governments, and, of course, support for governments where there's clear violations of human rights. You have collaboration with Chinese companies. And then, of course, because we did the case study specific to South Africa in the Limpopo province, it's also very clear that South Africa is a very staunch supporter of China, also at the United Nations. And like Ernst mentioned, also in the specific case of the South African government, the details of the agreements and the transactions between China and South Africa and Chinese companies and South Africa is clouded in secrecy. And then maybe as a final point, one can mention that the footprint of China is growing in Africa, and it's not only in terms of mines and other financial assets, but also in terms of a military footprint and important things like helping build buildings for the African Union and parliamentary buildings for certain African states.
Right, and then Arends, you mentioned that you were in the US, and then you also talked about this report there. You talked to some influential people. But what were the sentiments that you picked up? Because this is a question I see on social media a lot, is that people are very curious about what the US actually notices and what they think about what's happening in Africa, specifically in regards to China and Africa.
Yes, so in our experience, it's one of the main political issues in the USA at the moment, at least in terms of our discussions we've had, is a concern about the growing global influence of China, or you could even say the threat of China to US interests, if you frame it from their perspective. What we also picked up is it's something it's a concern across the board, although we do know the US has two major political parties, and it's a concern for people in both parties, although they would frame their concerns differently. The one party would be more concerned about the growing influence of socialism and the economic consequences, and the other party would be more concerned about human rights abuses and the environmental impact and so forth. But both of these are very important issues. So it's something that we found resonates with both parties. It's something that, we've seen the US government and the State Department express their concerns about policies implemented by African countries that is to a large extent as a result of the influence by China. So it certainly is something that we've noted, people in the US, and we've noted it as well with other countries, especially Western countries, who are very concerned about the growing threat of China, as I said, to frame it as such, and to get more information about what is happening so that they can respond appropriately.
All right, and then Barend, you mentioned in the report that there's a complete lack of transparency when it comes to, for example, the extent and the conditions attached to China's financial contributions to Africa. How did you overcome this information gap in regards to actually putting valuable knowledge in regards to this in the report, but as you said, there is a lack of transparency? How did you overcome this?
Ernst, I wish I could say that we could completely bridge the gap to our satisfaction, but the challenge was, of course, to get, let's say, if you approach official sources and to get good information like one would expect, we could not obtain it. But luckily, when you speak to people on ground level, they are well informed, and of course, they are well informed about what is actually happening on ground level. And then you've got research institutions that are really doing good research, and then, of course, you've got journalists that also go around and gathering very good information. So from the reports from research institutions, talking to people on ground level and working with journalists, we could gather enough information to form a picture of what is transpiring. But of course, that does not take away the fact that we would actually like to see documents signed by, for instance, governments on both sides or the companies on both sides of this agreement.
And then also, Ernst, you mentioned specifically the relationship between South Africa and China, and this playing a huge role in actually prompting the creation of this report. But more from a theoretical perspective, what is the relation between the ideology of the South African government and the Chinese government that actually is forming the foundation of this relationship?
Yes, so that's a very important point, and we see it being repeated in statements by representatives of the South African government, but especially the South African president, who during his previous State of the Nation address spoke about his dreams for South Africa, a very utopian type speech about building smart cities and bullet trains and a bunch of stuff. And then he said that his vision for South Africa was largely influenced by his friend Xi Jinping, the president of the People's Republic of China. And we hear comments like that frequently about the great relationship between the South African government and China. So on a friendship basis, that's certainly there, and we can see that. One of the things pointed out in the report is that the Chinese Minister of Foreign Affairs has visited South Africa so frequently that it's not even newsworthy anymore. It's not in the news when the Chinese Minister of Foreign Affairs comes to South Africa, because it does it all the time. And I'm sure it goes for other African countries as well. So on an ideological level, one of the points in the report is about the term socialism with Chinese characteristics, which was, I think it was coined by Deng Xiaoping of China, which said that, listen, we have socialist policies, but it's not really the same as the Russian or the Soviet Union's policies. It's socialist policies, but it's adapted for China, to be applicable to the Chinese concept. And in that sense, you can say that the type of socialism that we see in Africa, in many African countries, is socialism with Chinese characteristics to an extent.
But so then is there a difference between Maoism and socialism with Chinese aspects?
Well, you can go, I think if you talk about Maoism, I think, at least in my view, you start talking about the tactics in which socialism was implemented by of course, Mao Zedong. And I mean, we know there were some really atrocious things happening under Maoism. So we don't see, you see some aspects of that, but I don't think that's the main point. The main point here is the idea of destroying the current system, destroying the current order, and replacing it with a new utopian idea, this utopianist thinking. And the line of thought is always more power must go to the government. A government must be stronger. Government must be the custodian of, for example, in South Africa, we saw it's already just taken through the courts that government is the custodian of minerals, for example. And the idea now that government has to be the custodian or in control of land redistribution. The consequence, of course, is the more power you give to government, the more power or the more freedom you take away from citizens. And this is typically something that's pushed by the Chinese government and that African countries are very, very susceptible to.
And then to get back to the content of the report, Barend, there was something specific in the report that caught my eye, and that was you're talking about the Messina-Makadu Special Economic Zone. Case study serves as a prime example of the impact of China's involvement in Africa on local communities. Can you elaborate on this, please?
So the same points of concern raised whenever you read about or you hear about China's involvement in Africa is also present with this specific project. So firstly, one can say, Ernst mentioned it, there's frequent visits of South African government officials to China, Chinese officials and companies visiting South Africa. Then there's announcements of vast investments, and we are really talking billions of US dollars, and then no further information about the strings attached. With this specific case, of course, as with any development project, there's in South Africa specific environmental legislation that you need to comply with. And in this case, there's some serious concerns with regarding the process that was followed. So, for instance, there was objections raised about the scoping report that was done. And it was not, let's say, superficial issues. It's really important matters, like they appointed the incorrect competent authority. They say, and this is the words that are used, irreversible and severe impact on food security, water, air and soil quality, and then even omission of basic information like water requirements. Now, of course, let's talk about the water requirements, and this is something that's also a big issue of the project, is Limpopo is a water scarce region. And the provincial government in their own report it like that. And they say it can actually become a bigger challenge in future because of climate change. So it's really ununderstandable how you can then say we will proceed with this project, but we do not yet know where the water will come from, and we also acknowledge that we are in a water scarce province. With the water scarcity, you can also connect the production of food. Limpopo is sometimes referred to as the Garden of South Africa. And of course, the moment you put down something that also requires a lot of water, of course you are going to create water competition. And the only other large water consumer currently in Limpopo province is, of course, food producers. So you are basically saying we are going to go into a competition for water between this special economic zone and the producers of food. Then another thing that is worth mentioning is a complete lack of consultation. Of course, like it usually is in the case of such projects, is you need to properly consult any stakeholder, but of course also local communities. Now, the community representatives we've spoken to in the province say that there's a complete lack of information and that many people are not even aware that such a project is in the making. Then there's also something about irrational decisions. For instance, President Ramaphosa announced that they will fast-track the building of a coal-fired power station. Now, and this, of course, then you had a reaction from very knowledgeable people saying, but how can you say we're going to construct another coal-fired power station in a time when we have surplus power supply? There's also some legal matters, because when you want to construct a new power plant, it needs to be included in what they call the integrated resource plan. Now, this specific power station project was not included in the integrated resource plan. So it seems that the approach is now to change the integrated resource plan to allow for this so that it can go ahead. But when we did the report, the current circumstances was that it basically would be illegal to go ahead. And then there's also some comments that I cannot describe in any other way as to say that it's really an insult to South African citizens. For instance, during one of these meetings where Chinese companies and South African government officials was present, one representative said, this project now will be the most competitive energy and metallurgical cluster in the world. Now, I mean, if you know something about metallurgical clusters, you know that you will have to be something, or it will have to be something really big to be the best in the world. And the problem with comments like this is that it creates expectations. And of course, an expectation creates a risk when you do not deliver on that expectation. Then there's also the usual allegations of irregularities against some of the officials involved. And there's also local things like an impact on road infrastructure. And I think that is a I think, a good summary of some of the most critical issues that we found, and which is typical of the projects that you would also find in other places in Africa.
I also saw in the report there was a mention of expropriation without compensation. Specifically, the report states that China has a direct interest in the South African government's pursuit of the policy of expropriation without compensation. Now, Arends, can you elaborate on that? What does that mean? How does this exactly work?
Yes, well, firstly, from a broader perspective, it's a typical example of what we discussed earlier about socialism with Chinese characteristics. We do know, in terms of expropriation without compensation, in 2018, well, at the end of 2017, the ANC, the ruling party in South Africa, adopted a policy of expropriation of private property without compensation. February 2018, it was passed through Parliament that the constitution has to be changed to empower the state to expropriate private property without compensation. And then one example in which this was pointed out is the example of Akkerland Boerdery, the farm. It's mentioned in the report. So what happened is the policy of expropriation without compensation, the constitution hasn't been changed yet. So this particular farming community, or the farmer, was given notice by government that his property is going to, or their property is going to be expropriated. They couldn't do expropriation without compensation yet, so they were then informed that they're going to be compensated at 10% of market value. And they have, I think they had 7 days to vacate the property, according to this letter that they received by government. There was a court case, and it then transpired that there was a bigger underlying story behind government's attempt to get their hands on this property as soon as possible, and that is that it was within this special economic zone, and there was a fair amount of coal reserves below the surface. And this is where, in this special economic zone, China was involved in developing coal factories and so forth. So the point was to get this community off the land so that the resources below the surface could go to these Chinese projects. And that's just one example in which China is directly benefiting from the policy of expropriation of private property without compensation in South Africa.
So does the report go into detail in regards to this specific matter?
Yeah, well, the report points out, I think, briefly speaking, what happened there, and then the report also has the references, the sources in which people can go and if they want to get more information about this particular case.
Excellent. And then also, Barend, just a final question for you in regards to the content. Something else that I noticed in the reports that you talk about the China's use of prison labor in Africa. What were the findings in this regard?
Arends, the allegations about prison labor used in Africa by China, of course, has been coming a long time. We fortunately could not find any tangible evidence to support it. There is conflicting reports, however. So some saying that it is happening, and of course also some saying no, it's not happening. So it is a matter that definitely, I think, it deserves further investigation. I think something else that is, however, worth mentioning is a worrisome issue about the reporting of child laborers being used. So for instance, there's some mention of children younger than 15 years working in mines supplying Chinese companies with ore. And I think this is something else. Of course, I would consider that even worse than prison labor, which also requires further investigation.
And then, Arends, in regards to where this report can be found and maybe even the future of it, how will AfriForum use this report going forward?
Well, the issue mentioned in this report is obviously very important, and as far as AfriForum is concerned, we regard this almost as an introduction into a very important issue that we need to keep an eye on. So I'm convinced that from AfriForum's side, also in working with Opinor and as a civil rights organization, we will continue looking into this. The report will, of course, be published on AfriForum's website and on Opinor's website, so it will be fairly easy to find. But this is something, there's so much in dealing with a report like this that there's so much that you can't get to in the particular scope of the report. And the report also, there's a lot of information in the report, and there's a lot of very shocking information in the report. But there's also a lot of information that we still need more answers on. And one example is the prison labor example. There's news reports in the New York Times and the Washington Post and so forth saying that this is happening in Africa, that China is using prison labor. And the allegation is it's prison labor, and then once the project is completed, the prisoners are let go. They are freed in these African countries, and then the Chinese company goes back to China. That's the allegation, and then there's conflicting reports saying, no, this isn't true. So we need to find out to what extent is this true. Is it just a conspiracy theory, or is it actually true? And then another point is, as Barend pointed out, and I've pointed out, the secrecy regarding these deals. So there's a lot more that needs to happen, and it's not only a theoretical or an interesting discussion. It's something that really affects people's lives in Africa. If we're talking about Chinese companies moving in and doing certain things, an impact on the environment, if we're talking about the consequence in terms of the economy and so forth, it has a very tangible impact on people's lives, more than they would imagine. And it's not only the case for South Africa, it's the case for the whole of Africa, and it's also the case for the rest of the world. Because what China is doing in Africa has an impact on global power dynamics, and that's why we believe it's a very, very important issue to look into, and we'll certainly keep an eye on this, and we'll certainly keep communicating about this in the future.
And then, Barend, just in regards to Opinor as the think tank, what can people do to support you with the good work that you do and the future research projects that you will embark on?
Ernst, I think they can visit our website, of course, and the information is there to make donations. And of course, they can spread the word about Opinor, and if we share things, they can also share it. They're also welcome to engage us on things, especially matters that is important to communities in Africa, and maybe we can look into it.
And then another question in regards to maybe not even just what AfriForum is trying to achieve with this report, but maybe the broader picture in regards to why this is such an important research to pay attention to and why the world must know.
Well, yes, so if the question is what happens when this relationship is unchecked, there are some really concerning things pointed out in the report. And maybe one way to explain this is how China's foreign policy strategy has shifted from the 70s and what we saw in the previous century to the way it's being implemented today, where the focus used to be very much on sending emissaries to other countries and sort of expanding there. The focus is now different. What China is doing now is taking people, and especially in this case, taking African leaders, presidents of different countries, young politicians, upcoming politicians who might potentially one day become the president of this country. That's part of the strategy. Business people and so forth, students, leaders of companies, to take them to Beijing to provide them with training on what it's described as and how they describe it. It's training in the China model. And that also includes training for political parties. And we've heard the ANC say they keep sending on a regular basis senior delegations to China to obtain what they describe as training in propaganda and party discipline and ideology. That's what the ANC says, the training they get from China. So this is something that we need to look at, because it's exporting China's ideology, in other words, to African countries. And the threat of this is, that's the one side, is the ideological side of this, and we know that goes back to the socialism with Chinese characteristics. And then there's also an issue of sovereignty of peoples in Africa, because the more China's footprint in Africa expands, the more these African countries stack up in their debt to China, the more China gets control over the continent. And the more China gets control over the African continent, the more freedom declines for people on a local level. And that's why we see the necessary consequence of this would be more aggressive socialist policies, more aggressive policies that take power or freedom away from the people and people's choices away, and gives more power to the government. And it's not so much power that goes to the local government, to the South African government or the Zimbabwean government or the Zambian government, for example. It's it's power that goes to the Chinese government at the end of the day, that effectively gets more control over the African continent and over people living in Africa. So it's a very important thing for people in Africa to take note of.
All right, thank you very much for an interesting conversation. And as my guests told you, you can, if you want to read the report for yourself, the entire report will be available on AfriForum's website and also Opinor's website. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you found this interesting in regards to what was discussed here today, be sure to share it with people that you also might think will like to know more about China's impact in Africa and China's presence in Africa, but also any of the topics that were discussed today. If you're watching on YouTube, you can leave a comment as well with your thoughts or maybe even questions. And then as well, if you want to follow Ernst Roots, you can find him on Twitter, and you can find Barend Ace there as well. So thank you very much for watching, and enjoy the rest of your day.